So welcome to the August 2nd podcast of Record Eraser. I'd like to welcome Brandon Flood, former Secretary of Pennsylvania's Board of Pardons, to be interviewed and to discuss things that happen on the board. I am in awe of Brandon. In fact, I feel awkward calling him Brandon because for years when he was on the board, I was thinking, Honorable Secretary Flood, because I was always on a Zoom interview or doing something. But he's pretty laid back, and he's here, and he agreed to give us his perspective on the Board of Pardons, practices and procedures and things like that. So thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mark.
You're welcome. Brandon, can you start by telling us about your background and how you got appointed to the Board of Pardons?
Yeah, so at least professionally speaking, I began working for the House in 2010. I actually began interning there for the House Health and Human Services Committee. So once I got that internship, I knew I wanted to stay in government, or at least have some imprint on changing legislation or drafting legislation. So I spent probably about 8 years with the House. And in the course of doing that too, I also served as the political action chair for the Pennsylvania NAACP. So my job, I interface very closely with candidates for public office, particularly statewide offices. So in the case of the Board of Pardons, I was able to interface very closely with all of the candidates for lieutenant governor. I often held candidates forums. And for me, obviously, having a criminal history myself at the time, pardon or clemency reform was something that I wanted to tackle. So I had sent a lot of policy ideas to every candidate for lieutenant governor. And obviously for me, I was hedging my bets. One of them has to win, right? And most of them that ran didn't really have a huge knowledge base about clemency. So I wanted to kind of give them a heads up and also give them, information so they can kind of hit the ground running. So when Lieutenant Governor Fetterman won, I ended up following up with him, and he saw something in me that he said, and I told him I was going through at the time I was actually going through the pardon process myself.
Right.
I shared that with him. At the time, most people in government didn't know my background, so when I shared with him that I had a background going through the pardon process, the Lieutenant Governor extended me an opportunity.
That's actually fantastic.
Thank you.
That kind of open-mindedness, and also, so you actually get into the legislation, like the statutes that are passed and things like that. You're familiar with the language and the...
Yeah, that's actually how I even stumbled upon executive clemency. So I knew how it worked from a statutory standpoint, but obviously not from an administrative side. So I spent 8 of my years with the General Assembly, and most of my time spent with the General Assembly was in a research and analysis capacity.
Well, so even as a lawyer, with 3 decades of criminal justice, like we read criminal procedure and memorize it, and we read the criminal statutes, and before it was found unconstitutional, we read the mandatory sentencing guidelines and the sentencing guidelines. The sentencing guidelines are still, I think, legit. But once we learn the practitioner's aspect of it, like we don't go back to the statutes or see how they were written or see how they were developed or even know anything about how the debate might have shaped the statutes as it went back and forth. We just take what we're given and run with it. So frankly, I think that's really impressive. It's policy is, well, it's over my head. It's over my pay grade. So can you tell us about your time as the secretary to the board, and when were you appointed, and how did you get involved, and how did they proceed, and what was it like?
Yeah, I talked about engaging all the candidates for lieutenant governor. So when I had reached out to Lieutenant Governor-elect Fetterman at the time, I was actually supposed to be starting a new job with the governor, overseeing his commission on African American affairs. So my outreach to the lieutenant governor was to say, hey, I'm starting this new position in about a month. One of the agenda items I want to tackle is clemency reform, and then I shared my background. So, so for that, and that's where he saw the value in that. And ironically too, as I went through the pardon process, I had the good luxury of having a pretty healthy working relationship with my 2 predecessors. So Steve Burke, who was the former secretary, and also Mavis Nemo. So So for me, and believe it or not, Mavis actually told me not to take the job once I was extended it. She talked about, how large the backlog was. Obviously it's a very labor intensive job, but obviously I saw this as an opportunity to really make some change. I knew this wasn't a position I was staying for, a decade or in my career. So yeah, I came into the position with a very assertive mindset. I scheduled a meeting with each board member directly as soon as I came in, and very strong personalities on that board. So for me, I knew I had to come in, and strike that fine balance of not being too overbearing, but also being assertive and letting them know that I know my stuff, especially from a regulatory standpoint.
Right, because frankly, while some of them, I guess Josh had been on the board as the Attorney General for a number of years, but when there's a new administration comes in, a lot of them don't know anything about it.
Right.
And it's the secretary that is the engine that holds the wheels on the road that sort of educates them about this is how it happens, et cetera.
Right, and part of what I learned very quickly was that we were able to, do a lot of things administratively, that our regulations were somewhat nebulous in what we couldn't do and could do. So for me, it was all about striking that sweet spot, and also doing a lot of things in pilot form. That was how I was able to effectively be able to get them to make some changes administratively by saying, hey, let's pilot this for 6 months to see whether or not it bears fruit. So, I had a lot of latitude in doing that, early on, and we were able to change some things. And, obviously the drawback with changing things administratively is it's not enduring, it's not law. So as you mentioned earlier, any new administration comes in, certainly they can do away with those administrative changes.
Right. And when did you start with the board?
So I started officially April 1st, 2019. So April Fool's Day, right?
Yeah. The joke's on them.
Right.
So that's the real deal. So then also, how big was the staff at the point where you joined the board?
Yeah, we had a very small staff. I think at the time it was between like 5 and 7 staffers. For me, again, leveraging my legislative experience, one thing I saw historically was the board of pardons never participated in budget hearings. So they just kind of relied on the lieutenant governor and the governor to carry their water, whereas I wanted to be able to interface with those appropriation committees, outline what our needs are, be able to show them, obviously, corresponding reductions in recidivism rates, and then more importantly, return on investment. So that was something that we engaged in. We were able to get, I was able to get $500,000 my first, at least fiscal year there. So yeah, we were a small staff, and even right now, I think they're maybe got 9 or 10 folks now.
Well, I heard they doubled it, and I wasn't actually sure if the budget increase went through. I guess the budget's still...
Yeah, still in limbo. I'm being told that at least the Senate will reconvene sometime this month as opposed to September. So hopefully that'll be finalized in the next coming weeks.
And I don't know if you know off the top of your head, but I imagine at the point where this staff, when you joined, 5 to 7 people, there had to be thousands of pardon applications pending.
Yeah. I mean, that was part of what, former Secretary Nemo told me was, hey, listen, the backlog is kind of never ending. So yeah, there certainly were thousands, especially when it came to commutation. I think there were 2,500 commutation applications pending alone. So certainly was a huge backlog. So I would say between maybe 3,000 and close to 4,000.
That's amazing, because I remember back in the day, I've been filing these since 2000 something, with the old 5 or 6 page form. You had to get the driving record, you had to list out of state convictions, traffic convictions, and the process literally, when I started doing this, was 3 to 4.5 years. And it seemed a completely paper process. Right. And so fast forward to 5 to 7 people walking into an office filled with, I guess, filing cabinets. So anyway, they have managed to expand their personnel a little bit, and also there's been digitizing going on. And how did the electronization of the pardon process take on?
Yeah, so that's still ongoing. Again, I was able to successfully lobby the legislature to see the value of investing. Obviously, long term, being able to pivot from hard copy applications to electronic. Certainly, the goal isn't to do away with paper applications entirely, because there are some people that are still, grappling with that digital divide, so to speak. It's a labor-intensive project. If I had to quantify where the at least the full digitization of the process is, I think they're probably about 65-70% there. It takes a lot of manpower and meetings with a lot of these different agencies that the board interfaces with to really be able to kind of pinpoint where those potential bottlenecks will be. And really be able to put forth a product that's effective, right? For us, the goal wasn't just to be able to get something out for the sake of saying we did it, but to be able to get something that certainly was a quality product.
A quality product, and I sat in on some of those share member meetings a year or two ago, I think when they thought it was going to be released maybe in January 22 or January 23.
23, yeah.
And so some of those share member meetings, I remembered, I mean, some of these people are people I've been working with for a long time, presenting things, mostly people on the board, but at one point part of the government was the computer part of government, and we were sitting there and I was like, well, I think this is probably a given, but I just want to ask the question, like, are attorneys that are representing their clients going to be given access to the portal to check on our own stuff, as well as applicants being able to check on their own stuff if they're representing themselves? And it might be my faulty memory, but it just seemed to me like this Zoom meeting, you could almost hear a pin drop like, attorneys, portal, access to client records. And then I think they went back to the drawing board, and I'm looking forward to it because I think it really is going to streamline things. And I know they're, what did you say, about 60% of the way there, so.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, I mean, that's part of what the time, that's why there needs to be more time to have these conversations, to ask these questions, to prepare for these potentialities. Obviously, being that this is on the board, you have two political or elected officials on there. It was more so, I can speak frankly now, it was more so an issue of the lieutenant governor trying to get to have it done by the time he left office, right? And for us, the communication between myself and him was that, hey, listen, while I get it, to be able to have that gold medal, so to speak, you want to put forth something that's actually functional. So I think that's where the conflict was, because there was an anticipation or expectation of it being done January 1st, 2023.
Right, and you know what? I think the aspiration of the lieutenant governor probably pushed it closer to that 60% point, but also I had mentioned earlier that I think it was in March that the Board of Pardons just announced that all of the expedited marijuana cases that had been filed online were going to be denied, but they could be refiled without waiting that additional 1-year period that you usually need to wait before you refile.
Right.
And that makes sense. I mean, there's no way a new administration is going to come in and look at all these applications and basically be asked to sort of rubber stamp them, but also not have vetted the process themselves. So that all made sense.
Yeah, and I think there's, as I mentioned earlier, there's limitations to what you can do administratively. There's some stuff that statutorily needs to be changed, particularly when you're talking about, I know a lot of folks in the criminal justice space talk about these mass pardons, right? Or pardons issued in a block, so to speak.
Right.
You have 5 board members, 5 different perspectives, so it makes it a little bit difficult for another board member or the chair to dictate, as opposed to you having the force of statute saying that you have to consider these factors or criteria. Right,
not to mention the fact while marijuana cases would usually be victimless, there are victim notification requirements for any of these processes. So that makes sense. I never thought about that. Do one of the things that, you can tell me if this is right or not, but when I used to go up to the Supreme Court room and the board members would come in, going back to the days of Corbett and I don't know if it was Mike Stack or even before that, all the way back to when Steve Burke was the secretary, they all came in and I sort of thought the Board of Pardons all hung out together, and maybe merit reviews, they'd hang out for the day and this, that, and the other thing. These days, as you know, it's primarily Zoom interviews and Zoom merit reviews, but they really don't, it doesn't seem to me like they don't get together behind the scenes and like chitter chatter about stuff other than reviewing a case and giving their vote. Is that accurate?
Yeah, certainly they don't convene as a collective. That was something that, as my time with the board, trying to make sure we had certain presentations, sharing information and being able to have Q&A with the board members, especially about potential changes that I and the Lieutenant Governor were proposing. But yeah, they're kind of in their own silos. Obviously during the time when they could meet in person, they might have sidebar conversations. Right. But nothing like retreats and active engagement with one another, which I think certainly there's value in.
Well, I admit it, I have virtually no understanding of the way Harrisburg works. And so when I would see these 5 all come out from the back room, and then they'd go back and vote really quick for like a half an hour or something, and then they'd come in and announce the vote. I thought, well, they probably hang out together all the time, and they don't.
Well, part of that's also, depends upon who the chair of the board is, too. Yeah. So personality-wise, engagement. So, I think if there's an emphasis on the Lieutenant Governor or the chair for those kind of convenings and that camaraderie, I think you'll see that bear itself out. But yeah, for the most part, all these folks have their own professions. They're here in a part-time capacity, so they're not usually trying to hang around too long.
Well, right. Plus, I mean, in the old days, they used to go to Harrisburg to all get together and come in there and spend the entire day or maybe more. And now with Zoom, I would expect them to be even more, just like a meeting. Attend this, get on, book out the whole day, but you're not going anywhere or sitting with anyone.
Right.
Are there any changes you notice or can talk about regarding the new board that is sitting? Or I don't know if you would still know about practices and procedures.
I think part of what we wanted to do when I was there, and I think you'll see carried over with this administration, is we wanted to be able to create different lanes, right? Different levels of review, because not every applicant for clemency is the same, right? There's no reason why someone who has a shoplifting case from 15 years ago should go through the same process that a lifer is going through for commutation. So I think breaking out those different lanes and levels of review certainly should help for the process to be more efficient, especially when it comes to nonviolent, non-sexual cases. So I think you'll see that continue. I think they've already done it somewhat procedurally with how they hold hearings now. And you have commutation hearings are completely separate from pardon applicants too. So I think that efficiency will carry on just beyond scheduling hearings, but also will kind of bear itself out in terms of the volume of applications heard and hopefully positive outcomes.
I had mentioned briefly earlier that the board was proposing, I don't know that they're doing it, it takes a while to implement things, but they had listed 10 and 15-year-old nonviolent crimes that were going to be moved onto the expedited track, which I at least still think is maybe a 1-year review process instead of the 2 or more.
Yeah, I think that's what, while certainly having personnel is helpful, I think the board has to look at how, they kind of have to break with tradition, right? So, and then for a lot of them, old habits died hard or tend to die hard, where you're so used to considering information X, Y, and Z for every applicant, where you don't need that for every case, right? So to your point, if someone's 15, the data is there to support it. If someone's 15 years removed from a nonviolent case, I think the stat is if someone doesn't recidivate within 3.5 years of either their conviction or release from confinement, the likelihood of them doing so is close to nil. So that's kind of has to be the mindset for the board, where you have these different levels of review. That way you're not asking for so much information from every applicant.
Right. I think it's wonderful. It's wonderful. And another thing you briefly alluded to was the fact that in the past few years there's been wonderful investigations and reports about the financial benefits to the Commonwealth and the communities of all these people that are able to get their records cleared and increase their employment, their housing, giving back to the community. It's millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah. I was there. We had 2 studies commissioned, one through the Economy League of Philadelphia, Greater Philadelphia, and then also a study done in conjunction with the Philadelphia Lawyers for Social Equity. So to your point, we looked at 2 two different factors. We looked at recidivism rates of people that go through the executive clemency process, and then we also looked at the economic benefit to the Commonwealth. And the Economy League said, for every person that goes through, the people that go through this process, it's a net of 16 million, to the coffers of the Commonwealth, right? People are able to, improve their career prospects, be able to earn more, and obviously folks that earn more tend to spend more. It goes right back into the economy. And the same thing for recidivism. We were to look at people who successfully went through the process and people who went through and weren't successful. We were able to see that people recidivated at a rate of, I think, 2% for people that went through this process successfully, and for people who didn't, they recidivated at a rate of 3%. And if you look at the Department of Corrections website, when it comes to recidivism, they boast of a recidivism rate of 70%. So I would take 2 and 3% all day long, right? So, and part of me getting those studies commissioned was not only to make for a compelling pitch for why clemency is a good investment, but also to be able to go over to the General Assembly and lobby for money, right?
Right, and especially, then we went through COVID and the lockdown, and we couldn't find manpower, and all kinds of economic deprivation started, and you need people working.
Right.
And I still have guys with felony records. Actually, my daughter told me she runs a restoration company, and there's been a ton of restoration work to do. She called 7 applicants on the phone and asked them, would you pass a background check? And they wouldn't. So then some of the guys go out and get their CDLs. Right. And then just, I think earlier this week, Yellow announced that they're going to be laying off 60,000 drivers. Yeah. Now, some of those guys have records. There's a reason why they're driving CDLs. Right. And those records just need to be evaluated and removed. It's
definitely a workforce development issue. I think that's why you've seen some bipartisan support over the recent years.
Yeah, well, it seems commonsensical to me. I'm pretty middle of the road. So I keep thinking of questions as you talk. This is great. You're familiar with all the different ways of reporting criminal records. Officially, the Pennsylvania State Police Quick E-Patch, I call it. Officially, the Pennsylvania State Police Full Access Review. Less officially, but very publicly, the UJS portal for researching a record. And then in the recent past, there's also been Clean Slate. Right. There's been record sealing algorithms that have been passed pursuant to very complicated legislation. And clients keep asking me, like I have one way or another, what I do is simply request the FAR, which tells, I think, every record, juvenile and that you have been fingerprinted for, that's on your record, although sometimes there are convictions that you weren't fingerprinted for. Right. And then the UJS portal, and I put them together, and usually I get maybe a 90% cohesive view of exactly what's on a record. But do you ever have questions, or do you understand the difficulty of reading a UJS portal record and comparing it to the FAR and wondering where is the state police person or legislator that actually understands why some records are hidden and why other ones aren't?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's part of that's an ongoing issue, and that's one of the reasons why on that UJS portal they have a disclaimer there saying not to use it for criminal background history purposes, or because the inaccuracies of what's on there, or just the lack of maintenance for that particular site. So certainly there are discrepancies, and especially the older the case is, someone's recollection may be different, or they may not remember they had a conviction, or in their opinion felt like this, I paid a fine, this didn't rise to the level. Sometimes it's just omissions, right? Willful omissions. So sometimes it's pretty easy, and then sometimes we have to do a little bit of researching. To your point about the state police, and I do that. Part of this issue kind of bleeds into my full-time work as a lobbyist. Is the state police has a huge administrative backlog themselves, right? So they're stretched thin. One of the things that the common refrain with the state police is that they need that administrative capacity. So that just doesn't impact firearm background checks, right? Which like part of what I lobby is gun control, but also when it comes to being able to provide accurate records, So yeah, it's it's a problem that persists, and like you said, trying to get be as accurate as possible.
So maybe you can forward to me like the name of a lieutenant or somebody in the Pennsylvania State Police that would come down to Lancaster and either host a CLE or come on the podcast and talk about Pennsylvania criminal records and how to read them.
Yeah, we can do that.
All right.
Got a guy in mind.
All right. Okay, so when did you leave the board?
So I left the board in December of 2022. Or at least I announced I left in 2022, officially left in January of 2023.
Okay. And then there was a new board coming in anyway.
Right.
What have you been doing since then?
So when I left initially, I had a brief stint as a lieutenant gubernatorial candidate, ran as a Republican. At the time, around the time when I announced my candidacy, I actually ended up being diagnosed with heart failure too. So I actually had a whole transplant in December of 2022. So obviously I had to suspend my campaign efforts. So took a little bit of a sabbatical, if you will, but also in the time of that surgery and the recovery is where I created the Lazarus firm too. I knew that irrespective of when I left the board or what I moved on to wherever I moved on to, I was going to continue to work in this space and obviously be able to leverage some of that institutional knowledge. So that was done officially. I didn't roll out the Lazarus firm until maybe about February of 2022. So I gave myself a solid month of not doing anything. So yeah, I've been doing that since that time. And then September of 2022, I actually ended up joining a nonprofit called Ceasefire PA. They're Pennsylvania's leading gun violence prevention advocacy organization. I was hired on as their lobbyist. So, I'm a gun owner. I'm a Republican, gunshot survivor, and then obviously have the policy experience working in the House. So I wanted to bring all of those qualities and skill sets to bear to really be able to make a dent, at least in the gun violence prevention space in Pennsylvania.
That's impressive. And also, if you're interested, we would be able to put links to the websites of your organizations down below or in the comments or wherever they go. So what is the Lazarus firm?
So the Lazarus firm is, I call it a one-stop shop for reentry, but our emphasis is really on shepherding people through the executive clemency process, both state pardons as well as federal pardons. Also do a little bit of work relative to employment discrimination. So being able, not every person who has a record is a suitable candidate for a pardon. So how can you navigate the workforce in the meantime until you reach that point of suitability? So helping people to be able to navigate the workforce during instances where they may be unfairly disqualified from employment or terminated. And then everything else, I would say also too for employers, educating employers about how to create reentrant friendly screening policies, right? A lot of these employers have kind of an arbitrary process. Either you have a conviction or you don't, whereas there are some that kind of are able to kind of tailor certain, at least what criteria they have in place for each position in an organization, right? So it's no blanketed disqualification. So really helping them to kind of hone in on the type of person or applicant who has a record, what's suitable for them and what's not, and more importantly, disabuse them of a lot of the misconceptions about people with criminal records, right? I know for myself, I was always the person that had a strong work ethic, and the vast majority of ex-offenders that I know, they possess that same quality.
Right. I was recently consulted by a corporation that hires a lot of these blue-collar guys, and they asked me to talk to 6 to 8 of their recruiters, and I got an idea of the questions that they were looking for, and so I zoomed on with 6 to 8 of them, and first of all, they were largely using UJS records, which shouldn't be used for employment purposes. Secondly, they had no idea how to read them,
Right.
and they didn't know if a null pros was a conviction or not. They didn't know if nolo contendere was a conviction or not. They had no training or vocabulary for understanding or reading criminal records. And actually, I think they got a little frustrated because after 30 minutes, I wasn't being too wonky, but I was just saying, look, this is the district justice level record. This is a common pleas level record. These are words you might hear like Section 17, ARD, 586 disposition. And after 30 minutes, I circled back to my contact and I said, what was going on? She's like, we just wanted to know whether to escalate them to HR or whether we should just reject them. And it was like, well, okay, but the people are sitting there basically with a binary mentality saying, we want to go A or B, but we don't want to learn the words or the vocabulary or the difference between a misdemeanor 3 and a felony 1. And so it was just, there's just a lack of information about the whole thing out there.
Right, and that kind of speaks to the point where, as I said, most of the mentality for employers that aren't educated about things they should consider is whether you either have a record or you don't. You know, you heard me talk about the USJ portal and that disclaimer on that site. It's not just because accurate information may not be accurate, but to your point, the user may not know how to read a document, right? Or and like you mentioned, they may just see something pop up and may not even look at may not even dig any deeper. Just use that alone as the pretext to kind of discard your app.
Yeah, that's amazing. One aspect of the Lazarus firm, I was on your website looking around and stuff, and it talked about, it mentioned the CHRIA, the Credit History Record Information Act, and some kind of service related to that. What does that involve?
Well, yeah, that kind of speaks to what you talked about with the me talking about people that maybe have been unfairly disqualified from employment or terminated, right? So in Pennsylvania, they have a controlling statute. You mentioned CRIA, Criminal History Record Information Act, and they have a very clear standard on what employers, particularly Pennsylvania-based employers, should be considering and what kind of records they should be considering when it comes to their screening process, right? So it says very clearly that employers are only supposed to consider felony and misdemeanor convictions to the extent that they relate to the position you're applying for. So essentially there's a suitability standard. So there has to be some correlation between what your conviction is and the job you would be taking on, your responsibility. So a simple example would be, obviously, if I have sex crimes or crimes against children, me trying to work into a school, an employer will be justified in disqualifying me because I meet that unsuitability standard. The other part of CREA also mentions that, convict, or at least arrest and non-convictions aren't supposed to be considered. And this goes to your point. And that's one way I'm able to tell whether an employer used the USJ portal or went through the state police, is because if you cite non-convictions or summaries, you couldn't have gotten that from the state police. They won't report that.
Right.
So that's where I try to, help. I'm able to help people challenge that. I've been successful, at least, and I've had to quantify it at least over a dozen times, especially in Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a fair chance policy. Where essentially the ban the box policy for any employer with 10 or more employees. So sometimes it takes for an outside person, and like you said, with that group you met with, for you to hear or be confronted with this information to say, hey, you know what, let us reverse course. And some of these employers, especially mom and pop employers, just out of sheer ignorance, right? They're just not familiar, right? But some of these larger corporations that have legal counsel, have the HR departments, they should know better. They should know better.
They should. But you have helped to write legislation, you read legislation, you worked in this process for years, and I have decades of criminal justice experience. Mom and pop and their manager hiring person or whatever, it's just, I don't know, there's not enough information out there.
Well, and that's the other thing too, is a lot of people, especially mom and pop, but even corporations, they use the USJ portal because it's free, right? So overhead for me, if we're conducting background checks, I'm not going to pay this money to go through this other entity when I can just go here for 10 seconds, free portal. And that was something, maybe about 5 years ago, we were pushing to change the level of access that people have to these. Now, some people may disagree, who has access to these records or how easily someone can access those records through the USJ portal. But obviously they had a public comment period. And when it comes to these regulations, average Joe citizen isn't looking for public comment periods, right? Or more importantly, they're not even interested in offering a comment. But who are? and I literally found this out from the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts. You know who was watching when that public period, comment period came out? The media, journalists, right? So one of the things when you see when someone when they're in the news, you usually see their criminal record, right? If they have a corresponding record. So a lot of folks from the media, no offense to this media market here, outlet rather, but that's who overwhelmingly provided comments and said that, hey, we want to have this unfettered access. So that sentiment won the day.
Right. It's also flamboyant and controversial, and it's really just horrible too, because even once somebody's been pardoned and expunged, it can be really hard to get their Google search or a mugshot like deleted or anything. Like the internet never forgets.
Hey, listen, it literally happened in mine this was maybe about 2 weeks after, I would say maybe a month after I got a pardon. I applied for this apartment in this apartment complex. They ran the background. Now I already had the pardon.
Right.
But to your point, I didn't go through with the expungement piece. So this is before we were able to get records automatically sealed that are pardoned, although the goal was to be able to get them expunged. The compromise was the sealing. So you could still see my dockets in the USJ portal at that time. So again, this is kind of a telltale for me to be able to find out whether you used it or not. So they denied me, and I said, well, the only way you could have gotten anything about me was if you went through that portal. So I screenshot them the disclaimer on the USJ portal website, and then I sent them a copy of my charter for clemency. So it took maybe about an hour and a half. They reversed their decision. I've been living there since then, so it's about 3 months.
Well, and do you know
3
what?
years, right?
Yeah, and you're like basically at the pinnacle of all things related to pardons, records, and clemency. And most people just get turned down for their housing, and they're like, why do they still know?
Right.
I wonder if the CREA, I wonder if that creates a cause of action for employers that use records inappropriately.
They do. And a funny thing, you mentioned that too. So at the time when I was secretary, so who largely oversees the enforcement of CREA is the Attorney General's office. So they have a division. It's a division of one person, which I found out, who's enforcing this, right? You have all these employers in Pennsylvania. And I said, how do you guys have one person overseeing this, right, or taking on these enforcement efforts? And obviously they didn't give a good reason, said no, budgetary-wise. So what I told them is, hey, develop me a brochure, right? I'm not an attorney. Develop me a brochure of how someone, a layperson who doesn't have access to an attorney, can be able to pursue this cause of action against an employer. Right. That was in 2019. I still haven't gotten the brochure yet.
That's amazing, because you don't want to use lawyers, but lawyers will chase a cause of action.
Right.
Well, that's a whole lot of good information. I didn't know if we were just... I think we covered a lot. Do you have any questions or anything you didn't get asked?
No. I consider you a brother in arms, right? I like to say we don't have competing interests. We have aligned interests, the same way that you have a McDonald's across the street from a Burger King, right? So, we can coexist, be able to bounce things off of each other, and more importantly, work collaboratively to make the executive clemency process a more efficient process. I
agree. There are literally an unlimited number of these convictions out there handicapping people every day in 100 different ways.
Right. Agreed.
Thank you.
All right, Mark.
So who's McDonald's and who's Burger King?
Well, he has. I think McDonald's was. They were created first, so we'll say Mark. I don't know how to do the research.
Hey, you know what?
Burger King.
Welcome to August 2nd's update from recorderacer.net, also known as Pennsylvania Pardon and Expungement Services. Just a quick update about some changes on the board, in the process. In June, we know that the board reviewed over 300 cases over a 3-day period. That was incredible. At the end of the public presentations, they actually recommended over 80% of those to the governor. Now, the phrase being recommended to the governor means that at least 3 out of the 5 board members thought the applicant should be seriously considered or receive a pardon from the governor. The governor is not obligated to do anything, but he knows that these candidates have received the support of at least 3, and in some cases, all of the board members. Also, I'll just mention here, there will be an email going out, but to all of those people that were recommended to the governor for a pardon, usually the governor issues a pardon within 3 to 6 months. And so to keep the encouragement going, I thought I would offer an incentive to anybody who was recommended to the governor. In June, I'll offer a 10% discount off of an expungement, so that when you get the pardon from the governor, all you need to do is forward it to us and we'll be ready to file the expungement petition to remove that from your record. So that is something that you'll see other emails or pages about, but it's a 10% prepaid expungement for anybody who was recommended to the governor in June. Also, the board has been speeding up their process. They're actually expanding the people who qualify for expedited. Now, it's not clear immediately when these people are going to be considered, but basically what they're doing is streamlining cases that are over 10 or 15 years old that are nonviolent seem to be heading for the expedited track, which means hopefully review in as little as a year instead of the normal 2 years. So they're doing that internally. I know that they are already conducting interviews and telling applicants about their interviews ahead of time, and that they're scheduling right now for merit reviews in November. And so they're working on cases from earlier that are already filling up the November 2023 merit review sessions. So that's exciting too. They're just moving faster and quicker. I also wanted to mention something that I had mentioned before, which was that in September of 2022, before leaving office, Lieutenant Governor Fetterman had created this online September expedited marijuana file your own pardon application electronically on the portal process. I don't know if everybody was up to date with that, but hundreds of cases were filed. And then when Josh Shapiro became governor and his new lieutenant governor, and they also appointed Celeste Trusty to the position of secretary of the board. Anyway, the board reviewed all of those cases that had been electronically filed in September and basically declined them. They said no, they're basically not moving forward on those at all. And usually if you're denied by the board, the rules say you have to wait a year and then you could ask again. But in this particular case, because they did this blanket denial of a process that they had set in place, they said that 1 year disqualification does not apply. And so if you applied online, whether you heard about it or not, if you applied online, your application was probably denied, and you can reapply as soon as you want without waiting that year. If you have questions, go to recorderacer.net, fill out a form, or call 717-925-7820. Also, I would be interested if people would just shoot me emails, mark@recorderacer.net, because while people either are waiting to apply for a pardon or once they apply for a pardon, they go into a 1 to 2 to 2.5 year process. And I'm wondering if there's other services that these people can use, that you can use, whether it's improving credit score, whether it's being able to improve your resume, whether it's taking a course on how to take a job interview or something like that. I'd be interested in just knowing about additional services that we could offer. And that's the only updates for now. I'm going to do a section on a frequently asked question I get. And sometimes you'll occasionally notice the fact that really there's only 2 ways to clear a record. One is an expungement, one is a pardon. You can expunge certain things right away without a pardon, but you can't expunge a felony or a misdemeanor conviction until it goes through that 2 year pardon process. So I got a question from this guy and also from many other people that says, hey, I've been doing a lot of research on this, and I know what I need is an expungement of my misdemeanor convictions. Is there any reason I can't go get my own records and fill out my own expungement application online without using an attorney? And the answer is yes, you can do that if you want, but it will not work, because a judge will simply deny your expungement petition after you've paid a couple of $100s for a filing fee, because the judge does not have statutory authority to clear a misdemeanor or a felony conviction until it's been pardoned. Now, the judge knows that, the DA knows that, the applicant doesn't know it, and nobody in the clerk of court's office is going to tell you that. You just get the denial, and then you wonder what went wrong. So the point is, this question, why can't I file my own expungement, is answered by the fact you don't need an expungement. You need a pardon because you have misdemeanor convictions. Once you get the pardon from the governor, you can file an expungement. And then if you want to file your own, that's perfectly fine. It should be easier, and it should work as well.